It's September 11th, 2001. I'm sitting alone in my office after having sent everybody home. I listen to the radio reports from around the country, from Washington, D.C. and New York City, in a field in rural Pennsylvania. And I recognize that this is one of those milestone events, one of those watershed events by which we measure our lives. There is the time before that event, and there is the time after that event. Every generation has them. For my generation, maybe it was the Kennedy assassination. For my parents, Pearl Harbor. For my grandparents, the stock market crash in 1929 and the Great Depression. For my great-grandparents, maybe it was in 1918 and the end of the war to end all wars. For my great-grandmother, it was 1903, the year the Wright brothers flew. She was absolutely thrilled. She was 15 years old at the time. Her father, not so much. If God had meant man to fly, he would have given him wings. But my great-grandmother lived to see Neil Armstrong walk on the moon. Now, along with those national events by which we mark our lives, there are also personal events that change the way we look at the world. And for me, one of those events was in May of 1980. I'm worried about the extinction of a bird, Kirtland's warbler. It's a beautiful little bird. It's got a faintly streaked yellow breast and a slate gray back and a song so sweet and clear. This bird nests in only 4 counties in northern Lower Michigan. In 1980, there are only 480 of these birds left in the world. At a ½ ounce apiece, the entire population weighs only 15 pounds. You can put the whole population in a brown paper grocery bag. It nests only in young jack pine growing on the poorest, sandiest, most sterile soils in the world. And jack pine is a tree species that's dependent on fire to reproduce. Because its cones are so hard, they only open up in the heat of a forest fire. Think about that, a tree dependent on fire to reproduce. A stand of jack pines, mature jack pines, has to die in a forest fire to spawn a new generation of jack pine. And that's where the warbler nested, in those young jack pine trees. They don't nest in the old trees at all. But forest fires pose a risk to life and property that we can't tolerate anymore. The Forest Service and the state of Michigan have done a good job in preventing forest fires and putting out the ones that do start. And as a result, the amount of habitat available to the Kirtland's warblers is declining. But we have a plan. We clear-cut large areas of jack pine for pulpwood, and we leave the branches and the tops scattered through the opening. And then when the weather conditions are just right, we burn the clear cuts, burn up the branches, burn up the tops, the cones open up, release the seeds, and a new generation of jack pine has begun. But we're falling behind on our targets. I know why. It's because the Forest Service isn't committed. This bird's going extinct, but there's always an excuse. Oh, the weather conditions aren't quite right. Oh, it's on a weekend, we don't want to pay overtime. Oh, we don't have enough equipment. The bird is going extinct. But one morning, the morning of May 5th, 1980, conditions seemed to be perfect. They start burning that clear cut, and there are flame lengths a foot, 1.5 feet high going through the clear cut. This is working great. That clear cut's like 200 acres. It's over a ½ mile square each side. And things are going just good. And then the fire burns into some slash piles along the control line. Slash piles of branches and tops they're several feet high, and the fire gets into that, and the fire leaps 5 feet, 10 feet, 15 feet, column of smoke rises up and embers drift out across the fire line, starting spot fires on the other side. That's not unusual. We have a crew to take care of that. My friend Jim's on a bulldozer with a fire plow. His job is to locate those spot fires, circle them with his fire plow so the hand crews can come behind and put those little fires out. But there are more spot fires and more spot fires, and then finally a spot fire starts in a patch of short jack pine. And the tops of those short jack pine catch fire, and the fire leaps from there to the tops of the mature jack pine, and a crown fire starts, and a huge column of smoke goes up, and embers drift to the east 200 feet across the state highway. Jim crosses the highway on his bulldozer, chasing down that fire, laying down a furrow. The wind swirls, and Jim disappears into the smoke of what has become known as the Mack Lake Fire. A firefighter will tell you that standing next to a crown fire is like standing next to the tracks as a freight train roars by. Air pulses and it feels like you're being drawn into it. There's a rumble and a roar, and you can almost feel the ground shake. When a crown fire starts, there's nothing a human being can do to stop it. While all this is going on, I'm 90 miles away in Cadillac, Michigan. I'm at a meeting. I know something's up when the forest supervisor comes in and he takes the timber staff officer and the fire staff officer out with him. I don't know what's going on, but at the end of the day, I race home, I turn on the television, and there's a banner going across the bottom of the screen. The Oscoda County Sheriff's Department requests all available manpower and heavy equipment to report to mile to battle a forest fire that's burned thousands of acres, destroyed 40 homes, and resulted in one fatality. Within minutes, I get a phone call from my supervisor. Pete, grab your fire gear. Meet at the office in 30 minutes. So I pull on my green fire pants and my yellow fire shirt. I lace up my leather boots. I grab my hard hat and my gloves and my goggles, my fire shelter and canteen. I throw them in with my fire pack, race to the office, and I join a growing crowd of people dressed just like me standing in the gravel parking lot in the twilight. I see Cliff, the fire staff officer, in the office. I go in. Cliff, who died? It was Jim Swiderski. Jim and I were both young wildlife biologists. The last time we talked was the previous winter, and we talked about how the wildlife program would be different if we were in charge. We talked about how much fun we had operating bulldozers on the fire line. Jim? That doesn't make sense. The next morning, I'm standing on the fire line. There's no fire left. It had burned itself out the afternoon before when it ran out of pine trees. But I stand on the fire line, green on one side, black on the other. The air's heavy with the smell of a burned forest. It's quiet, there are no birds singing. I walk out into that burned area, standing among the blackened skeletons of burned jack pine. Naked black branches thrust upward as though beseeching a higher power. And in the tops of those branches, I see jack pine cones that have opened like flowers blossoming in the morning sun. I kneel and I look at the ash on the ground, and there's a jack pine seed there and there and there. Every few inches there's a jack pine seed. I know that with the next spring rain, those seeds are going to germinate. Kirtland's warblers will nest in this place. Now there's an investigation. Mistakes were made. and the results of each mistake compounded on the results of previous mistakes. I know that if I had been in charge that morning, I would have started that fire too. I know that if I had been on that bulldozer, I would have done the same thing Jim had done. 7 years later, the first Kirtland's warblers nest in the Mack Lake burn. 20 years later, there are 2,000 Kirtland warblers. 30 years later, there are 4,000 Kirtland's warblers, and they nest not only in those 4 counties in northern Lower Michigan, they nest in similar habitats in Wisconsin and Upper Michigan and in Ontario. The bird is no longer on the brink of extinction as it once had been. And that's a good thing. But today I ask myself the same question I asked myself while standing on the fire line of the Mack Lake Fire. Is saving a species from extinction worth the life of one young man?